Okay, this is Haroon. Welcome. Assalamu alaikum. I want to go through a chapter from a book that I've been reading. It's a book by Huston Smith. The author's name is here, Huston Smith. And it's a very good book. And he has a chapter, the first chapter, where he talks about modernity. So don't worry about modernity and what postmodernity is. I'll go through that in a moment. The name of the book is Why Religion Matters, right? And he really answers that question in this chapter. But before we do all of that, let's kind of really run through the chapter together. So let me just move this to one side so we know we're not going to cover that anymore. All right, so now the author begins with a number of questions. Number one is that we as human beings, wherever we live, wherever we are, we usually have three problems. One of them is food. Where do we get food? Where do we get shelter from? How do we protect ourselves from, depending where you are, hot weather or cold weather? The second thing is, how do we get along with one another? And the third thing is, how do we relate ourselves to things around us, our relationship with one another, but more broadly, our relationship with the wider world, the universe, everything else. So the first question is really a question of nature. The second one is a question of society or social aspects. And the third one is to do with religion. Okay, so these are very, very important. Now, it might be to some of us that religion is not really that important. But it's worth remembering that we've been finding religious artifacts and they are amongst the oldest things archaeologists have ever discovered. So religion has been really, really important for humanity forever, if you like. And one way to think about these three questions is to kind of put them into three periods of history. Okay, and you need to follow this very, 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 very carefully. So these three problems become clear, become distilled for us when we think of them as three periods in history. So three major periods, if you like. There's a traditional period, which is really from human beings up to the rise of modern science. So from whenever the first person came along to modern science. That's called a traditional period, for want of a better phrase. And then you have the modern period, which kind of takes over from here. And this is the rise of modern science, right? So, and this is up to the first half of the 20th century, right? And then you have what most people would say we live in, the period that we live in, which is postmodernism. This era that's beyond science. And we'll come to that. We'll go through these periods one by one as well. And this is what Friedrich Nietzsche, a very important philosopher, if you don't know him, that's fine. He anticipated, right? He anticipated that a period would come where we would live in a postmodern world as well. Okay? And so each of these periods poured more of its energies into and did better by one of life's inescapable problems than did the other two, right? So for example, modernity, this period here, gave us our view of nature, and that's largely thanks to science, right? It gave us a foundational understanding of science as well. So it deserves credit for the discovery. Post-modernity, the period that we live in, and you'll all be familiar with this because you all live in this milieu, you all live in this world right now. It's a lot to do with social injustice. There's a lot of cause and concern movements around social injustices, less to do with science, and I'll come back to that, but more to do with social injustices than previous people ever did. So we've done this one. This leaves this one, which is what we call worldviews. Okay, metaphysics is a better word that we can use as well. Okay, and this is different to cosmology. Sometimes people get these two mixed up. But so we've dealt with social injustices, we've dealt with science, but what about worldviews? Everything that kind of puts everything together. This one here, one of the three questions, the third question that we had, how do we relate ourselves to things? Okay, and so metaphysics, for those of you who may not be familiar with this, is to do with the big questions, right? The big questions around what there is, right? It deals with everything that is out there. It's kind of like the big questions, and this is different to cosmology, but cosmology is really focused on the study of the physical universe, which is science, which is really related to the modern period, the middle one here as well. Okay, now we've got this together. We've got a framework that can help us. So we've got a framework which takes us from nature through society to the big picture. Okay, and there's an idea that one kind of does better than the other ones in certain respects as well. So let's look at this in more detail. Let me try and bring up the next page for you. I've done some already, so let me save that one and the next one. Okay, so modernities, cosmological argument. Okay, so let's give you some background. In 16th and 17th century, Europe in particular stumbled upon a new way of knowing that we refer to as the scientific method. Okay, so this is the modern period, right? It centers on things like the control experiment, which gives us obviously modern science as we know it today. Okay, this thing, modern science that we talk about. Now, we have genetic science, so something called genetic science, which is, we have to be careful that we don't think that science is something new. It only came in the 16th, 17th century. We had something called genetic science. People were doing scientific experiments for a long, long time, right? Looking at nature, looking at patterns as well. This is something that we've been doing. But what happens is control experiments add to genetic science, right? And so we can test hypotheses, right? Theories that we have, we can separate them from false ones. And so what happens brick by brick, we kind of like get to an idea of truth, right? We keep doing experiments, we keep building, we keep building, we keep building, we keep building, and then the structure comes. And eventually we get an idea of like some things are true as well. Okay, and this is what's called the scientific worldview. Okay, this is something very, very new that happened, or that was given birth to in the 16th century, 17th century. None of us were around then, but we are all children or grandchildren of that world that happened, right? So it's very, very important. This is why studying history is so, so important. Okay, and so everything that you learn at school comes during this period. Okay. And it's part of the air that we breathe that we don't even describe it, right? We don't even need to think about it. It's part of where we are everywhere around us. But it's worth still just giving a little bit of background so people kind of understand what this worldview encompasses. Now, of course, it would take lots of lectures and books to really get to details with this, but I'm going to give you some basics as well. So some people say around 15 billion years ago, a long, long time ago, an incredibly compact pellet of matter exploded to launch its components on a voyage that still continues today. Right, differentiation set in as hydrogen proliferated into the periodic table, atoms gathered into gaseous clouds, stars condensed from whirling filaments of flame, and planets spun off from those to become molten drops that pulsated and grew rock encrusted, as Huston Smith says in his book. Okay, so narrowing our gaze to the planet that was to become our home, we watch it grow, ocean filmed and swathed in atmosphere. Some 3.5 billion years ago, shallow waters began to ferment with life, which could maintain its inner milieu through homeostasis and could reproduce itself. Life spread from oceans across continents and intelligence spread. Several million years ago, we're told our ancestors arrived. It's difficult to say when. For every few years, paleontologists, for example, they discover new discoveries that set the human race back another million years or so. So we don't really know when all of this happened. But this is something that we're taught in primary schools. And it's a familiar story to many of us. Okay, and so this is kind of like modernity's cosmological argument. Okay, and so what happens is because of this, the traditional worldview becomes less important, the one that came at the beginning, right? So I want to really talk about that one as well. So let me go back to that and try and find it for you. Here we go. So before we go into this, I want to just talk about traditional cosmological worldview, and that became redundant because scientific cosmology took over. Okay, So this is something to bear in mind as well. Then we have postmodernism. Postmodernism is the world sort of we're living in now, which is post-science, if you like. And I'll explain why as well. So there's some shortcomings of this worldview as well, and I want to talk about it as well. So we've gone from modernity, which began in the 16th, 17th century, to postmodernity, which is sort of where we are now, starting in the mid 20th century as well. Okay, so traditional cosmology, the way we understood the world before, is no longer in the race. So let's look at postmodernism. Now, science we know is cumulative, right? So it follows as a matter of course that the cosmology we have in the 21st century is an improvement over what we had in the middle of the 20th, right? So we're building on what people have done before us, our ancestors as well. But there's a problem here. While modernity gave us science and there was so much work that took place, in comparison, in our age, it's not been such a great time, right? It's not been as good as what would have been before. So we've got a lot of stuff that's happening, but if you really think about it, we haven't reached the heights that was reached under modernity, under the scientific world as well. So that's something to bear in mind. For example, Newton's worldview, his discoveries, all these things, we haven't had nowhere near as much. We had lots of discoveries, but in our period, we've had less discoveries. Okay, and what's actually really happened is that under postmodernism, we look less at discoveries, and we question more truth. Is there really truth? Is there something can we know truth? And because they question this, it creates this problem called relativism. Really important. Well, it's all relative. You hear people say, well, it doesn't really matter, right? Everybody has their own opinion, right? Everybody has their own views. So this is something to bear in mind. So postmodernism is all about society and not about science, right? Very, very important distinction to be made as well. So this is something to bear in mind as well. So we've had a lot of justice movements, Black Lives Matter, so forth as well. Things that wouldn't have been civil rights movement, people have been given their rights, people who are marginalized and discriminated against have been given their rights, they've been recognized and so forth as well. That never used to happen under this worldview, but in the worldview that we live in, this is happening. So there's a social movement, it's a revolutionary movement in that sense, but less to do with science, right? So this is something that we should also be aware of. So let's move on to the next one. And let's make sure I go in the right direction. So the traditional worldview. Okay, so we've talked about the traditional worldview's shortcomings as well. Okay, but let's talk about modernity's metaphysical shortcomings. So under modernity, the big questions were reduced to cosmology. Right, that's all people really focus on. So we've had all these wonderful discoveries, but we haven't really been able to answer some of the bigger questions. So we might have machines, we might have developed nuclear energy, lots of things, but we haven't still dealt with the big question. Remember, there were 3 questions that we began with, right? How to find food, how to get shelter. We've been able to answer that. We've been able to look at other questions that we looked at in the first slide. So let me go back to that one again, just to show you very, very quickly. Right, here we go. Right, how to get along. So we've kind of looked at this question, scientific. We've looked at this one, but we still haven't been able to answer some of the big questions, right, which need to be answered. So the traditional worldview is very, very important to bear in mind. So modernity was metaphysically sloppy, right? We had so much scientific accomplishment that science almost became like God or religion, right? Under this period, it kind of like replaced religion, right? It became sacred almost as well, and so forth. But it was a materialism, right? It was focused on what we could only see. It wasn't not looking at beyond beyond, right? Not looking at the big questions. It could only answer things that you could see. So it depended on matter, okay? So this is something that's worth bearing in mind as well. So it wasn't able to answer the big question. It was able to provide us with food. It was able to provide us with shelter, right? We discovered so many things. We could get to the moon. We've got to Mars. We've been able to do so much, but it's not been able to answer the big question. Postmodernity was able to answer the questions of society. But again, same problem. It wasn't able to answer the big questions, nor was it able to give us a worldview. It wasn't able to guide us in the world that we are in. Right? So the third question about how to relate to one another hasn't been answered by both of these worldviews, neither by the modern worldview, neither by the postmodern worldview. And this is really, really important to bear in mind. So I just wanted to give an introduction to this, and I wanted to kind of give people a kind of like an introduction of how worldviews can also be seen through movements. So these three movements are very, very important. Right? The traditional period. Let me get the right pen for you. The traditional period, the modern period, postmodern period. Traditional period was all about worldviews, religion, answering the big questions, which we don't do anymore. Right? Modern period was about science. They gave us food, they gave us shelter. We were able to achieve so much. In the postmodern period, the world that we live in, we've not been able to get not much success in science, right? Compared to the previous period. And we've been able to answer sociological questions, challenges that face us as a society. But again, both of these periods were empty of the most important question, which is the question of metaphysics, the big questions, which we don't study in our universities. I mean, how many of you have been to school, college, university, and you've been philosophizing about the big questions? You've done science. You're probably doing sociological studies. You're probably involved in movements that fight for justice, right? Or you're involved in some job where you're working in science or industry. But how many of us are thinking about the big questions, right? And this is where, as a Muslim, Islam is so important, because Islam as a religion relates to nature. It relates to society, and it also relates, of course, by itself to big questions. So Islam is one, or the only one in my view, that brings all three together. I hope you found that useful. Please do share some comments so I can make more videos and be inspired by you to make more videos. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.